Hello, my name is Osha, and today is March the 12th, 2026. It's 13 days since the inception of the joint Israeli US war against Iran. And I'm continuing with my discussion on the analysis of the war. I've done two earlier videos, this is the third. I'm just going to look a little bit at the numbers and in terms of the psychological impact of the war. So, part of war uh, is psychology. Psychology is a strong element of warfare, right? So, um, a reason I can say this is apart from doing, studying military history and studying, things on war. I'm not a warfaring person, by the way. I'm not a martial person, but I did martial arts as a child. Just growing up, it's good for to be able to build confidence and not to be bullied as a kid, right? So I was very fortunate that I did karate, I did taekwondo, I did boxing, I got into bodybuilding, and I stuck with bodybuilding. So once I started bodybuilding, I had no bully. Nobody wanted to bully me. Nobody wanted to fight me because, I look like I could take care of myself, right? So everybody is, so that bodybuilding, the physical, the appearance of a strong physique, right, uh, is it's sort of like a deterrent, right? Um, so so it's kind of even funny. Even while I was wrongfully detained, I've done videos talking about how I was wrongfully detained. I'm a law-abiding American citizen, right? And but I was wrongfully detained and assaulted by Montgomery County Police, which filed false charges against me. Now, while I was wrongfully detained in jail, people there are normally, mainly hardened criminals, people who are supposed to be, right, they're in jail because they commit crimes, right? But people didn't pick fights with me because of my size. It was just, people just assumed I would be able to take care of myself, and I was given respect just because of size, not because I was doing anything threatening or anything like that. So that's another reason why many nations like to hold, want to possess nuclear weapons in this era of nuclear weapons, atomic bombs, and everything. Nations want to hold nuclear weapons as as a deterrent. So, for instance, Israel and the U.S. are not, they didn't invade their enemies in North Korea because North Korea has a nuclear bomb. They haven't invaded China. They haven't invaded Russia because these nations have nuclear bombs, and that's why Iran has wanted to possess a nuclear weapon. But in any event, um, Iran. Before I get to what's going on today, I just want to quickly talk about a little bit about um, Iran in the 1970s. Iran in the 1970s, prior to the Islamic Revolution that brought in the Ayatollahs in 1979 and the Islamic Republic, um, Iran had built up the fifth strongest military in the world under the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, right? They built up the fifth strongest military in the world because um, the Shah was trying to modernize Iran, right? Um, I've seen a video in which, although they claim, there's the narrative is that he was a stooge of America. Well, the documentary I recently saw of him talking, and he was a very intelligent man, by the way. Um, and Mike Wallace was interviewing him, and he read him a CIA report on his psychology and his a profile, psychological profile of the Shah. They called him an intelligent person, but a megalomaniac, right? That he was a megalomaniac, and it's interesting that the Shah may have corroborated those concerns about his mentality or his psychology, because he was actually telling Mike Wallace that he sees apparitions, he gets dreams, visions, and apparitions, right? So that's like delusional, right? He did admit that he takes medication, right? So so those are concerning. Although he said he takes the medication he clarified and said the medication was for sleep. But for someone, you tell somebody that you're seeing things, apparitions, right? That's hallucinating, that's delusional, unless it's being induced by drug use, right? Unless that person is taking drugs. There are drugs drugs, that hallucinogenics, right? That will make you hallucinate. If you take certain drugs, right? LSD or whatever, right? Those drugs, will cause you to hallucinate, right? If it's not endogenous, so if it's for exogenous reasons. But anyway, back to what I was talking about. So that Shah invested in Iran's military, and Iran had the fifth strongest military in the world. Um, he was developing a nuclear program with the assistance of the United States, right? But once the Islamic Revolution overthrew him in 1979, they of course inherited that very strong military, right? They inherited that fifth strongest military in the world. America tried to circumvent its nuclear program, and that's the reason, that's been one of the pretexts that Israel and America have gone to war against it recently, with the decapitation and the assassination of its leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, its supreme leader, and other military leadership on February 28, 2026, which has precipitated the ongoing conflict. So that issue of nuclear weapons, the succeeding Shah, the current incumbent Shah now, the son of Ali Khamenei, that's Mojtaba Khamenei, has said that Iran intends to pursue its nuclear program aspirations. And I read a statement he just gave. He ostensibly gave today, just recently. They said in the conditions for cessation, they do not intend to reconcile unless America accepts certain conditions. So it's given America an ultimatum, certain conditions. They be expelled from all the military bases. They acknowledge Iran's rights to possess those nuclear weapons. So that's his demands. So their rights to possess those nuclear weapons, their sovereign rights, and the United States pay reparations for the losses. So he's made these steep conditions. I don't know if America is going to accede to those. So anyway, the Islamic Republic inherited the fifth strongest military, and then it was plunged into a war with Iraq, in which the U.S. and the USSR supported Iraq. And so it became hardened, and of course it has all these sanctions imposed upon it. It meant the economy of Iran went from being the 18th largest GDP in the world to today it's number 43, or by nominal GDP it's number 43. It's been impoverished because of these sanctions, right, against Iran, and it's had this ongoing war. It defeated Iraq. There was a stalemate in the Iran-Iraq war, which lasted 8 years, but it turns out that again during wars sometimes there's a lot of innovation, and the sanctions forced Iran to innovate. It's had very brilliant scientists. Again, Iran is an ancient civilization. It's had very brilliant. It has a history of having very intelligent, brilliant scholars, scientists, philosophers. In fact, I've done a video in which I explained that the very first university in the world, that's the first center of higher education, was actually in Iran. It was established in 271 AD. That's the Academy of Gondishapur, the first academy of higher education in the world. So yeah, Iran has a strong history, and despite the sanctions, it still has. It's ranked as having been in the top 15 of the most cited. It's actually ranked in the top 15 in terms of scientific production in the world. Number 15. You can imagine that in spite of all the sanctions, again, its scholars and its researchers are ranked in the top 1,000 of its researchers are ranked in the top 1% in the world, right? Top 1% in the world, according to essential indicators or whatever. I can't remember the the journal, the citation I saw it from. But anyway, so its scientists are highly respected. So it innovated and built all these cheap drones, right, that it could mass produce. So it has them in huge volumes. These cheap drones that cost roughly $20,000 to $50,000. That's what it's been using to fight America's superior, very expensive, let me say, very expensive ballistic missiles, right? America's missiles that it's been using and Israelis' missiles, they cost about $4 million. They cost millions and millions of dollars. But Iran has been, striking them at a rate of Iran. The U.S. Israeli forces have hit Iran, have launched 5,000 strikes since at least 5,000 strikes since February 28, 2026. Iran has responded with 3,000 strikes, and it's used these cheap drones and cheap ballistic missiles. They call them the poor man's cruise missile, but it's been effective in that it's made the war very costly for the United States and Israel. So it's hit them in the pocket, right? It's hit them in the pocket so that for every strike for every drone, every strike by Iran, it's been repelled at a cost of 100 to 1. So, 100 times, right, in dollar amounts, 100 times costlier in dollar amounts for the United States and Israel, right? 100 times more costly for every strike Iran makes and the counter strike has been 100 times more costly. So it's hitting America more in terms of dollars, right? Just because America's weapons are so vastly more expensive. So Iran was forced to innovate, however, and it used these cheaper drones that it can launch in volumes, huge volumes. And so Iran is trying to go the long haul. So there's something called a war of attrition, right? In warfare, again, warfare includes a psychological component. And when we look at I did an earlier video in which I compared the casualties, right? Iran has suffered far more casualties than the United States, right? So if you, in terms of CENTCOM, that's on the part of the United States. And by the way, there's this propaganda war, so there's misinformation going on, which is similar to what happened during the Vietnam War, when there was the credibility gap. The U.S. the presidency was intentionally providing the public with false information, so they didn't know the real state of the war and the real casualties, just so that the American public, would not be demoralized and want to pull out of the war. So, so the information I have from CENTCOM and from the U.S. sources, right, it says that 17 to 50 Iranian vessels have been destroyed. So the U.S. has significantly degraded the Iranian navy, right, by destroying 17 to 50 of its Iranian vessels. Of course, there have been a lot of military deaths. They said about 3,000 top military were killed. Iranian military were killed. We don't know how true that is, but given the recent intelligence reports released, that was released in Reuters, saying that, well, there's no risk or danger to the regime in Iran right now. That's not consistent with the conflicting information coming out from from U.S. intelligence regarding the regime. That so it doesn't look like their military has been severely degraded, since they still have control of the regime, and Iran has declared they're not conceding, and they're continuing. The President Trump had earlier said they wanted unconditional surrender. Iran has indicated they're not surrendering anything. They're in the fight for the long haul, and they're making their demands that the U.S. Military bases, U.S. be expelled from the GCC nations, from the Persian Gulf, and that the U.S. pay reparations. So those are not what a those are not what the loser in a war does. So back to a comparison with the uh, so in terms of bombing, there was a day that Israel was said to have dropped about 5,000 bombs, and the U.S. joint Israeli forces have dropped bombs across 26 provinces, in Iran. And so there's been the carpet bombing going on. And so Iran, no doubt, has suffered a tremendous amount of casualties with over 12,000 wounded, about 1,825 dead, and 1,300 civilians dead, compared to the reported losses of Israel of, well, just over 18 people dead, but about 2,700 wounded now, 2,700 Israelis wounded. And of course, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, which supports Iran, they've been launching, they've launched over 90 drones, over 210 missiles. They've been launching, missiles as well from Lebanon against Israel. They've suffered about 594 deaths, and hundreds of people have been wounded. So, but in terms of the comparative losses, the Vietnam War, the communist forces, that's the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, right, support the communist coalition that America was supporting South Vietnam against. They lost lives. They suffered. Their casualties were roughly 3-1, right? So they suffered 3 times the casualties that the U.S. and the South Vietnamese suffered, right? They lost 1.1 million people died in North Vietnam. Far more people died. Only 58. That's not only, that's a lot of lives for America. Over 58,000 Americans were reported dead or missing. But in terms of, they fought a guerrilla warfare against America, right? And it was they focused on a war of attrition in which America ended up losing its resolve to continue fighting. They were defeated and demoralized psychologically that they ended the war, right? So that's one of the things that you do in a war of attrition. But because Americans, they mined the land, right? They mined the land, and so Americans suffered a lot of injuries. Over 300,000 Americans were wounded from these mines, and they became amputees. They became crippled from these mines all over, Vietnam. So they set all these traps, booby traps, and mines, and over 300,000 people. Now, the South Vietnamese lost about 250,000 people died, but you can see that the North Vietnamese had far more deaths, over 1 million people. But again, in the war of attrition, they were in it for the long run, and they could keep on with those losses. And of course, many of those losses in North Vietnam, for the Vietnamese, by the way, were actually were civilian deaths. So they defeated America psychologically. The American forces were demoralized, and they withdrew, and the American public couldn't support the war anymore. Now, in terms of the casualties from the amputees, the crippling from the mines, it was 300% worse than America suffered a 300% incident rate, compared to the Second World War. So, the injuries the Americans suffered, severely demoralized, the American soldiers as well. And so, again, as I also indicated in an earlier video, that even in the Civil War, the Union forces lost 20% more lives than the Confederates, right? But the thing is, the Confederates didn't have resources again to continue. So the Union forces had more to keep you know, they had more forces that they could keep, more manpower, more resources they could keep throwing in, and they could go in for the long haul until the Union for the Confederates were completely destroyed. So the war of attrition goes long haul, and that looks like what Iran is looking to do now. By the way, remember America struck first. So in a war, in a fight, the aggressor who strikes first, of course, they make the initial gains, and the person acting in self-defense, the entity acting in self-defense, eventually recuperates, and over time they get better. They push back. They're successfully able to repel and beat down the aggressor. So just remember, even in Japan in the Second World War, Japan struck us first. Like I think about 1,000 people died. Over 1,000 people died with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I think a lot of lives. A lot of, it cost America a lot of lives. But over time, the the entity acting in self-defense eventually recuperates, and doubles up and is able to repel, beat back the aggressor. And this is what the Iranians seem to be doing. They've mined the Strait of Hormuz, and again, one of the tactics they're using in their asymmetric warfare is to hit America in terms of its finances, right? So the price of oil has shot up over $100 today. American stock markets, they're crashing, they're going down, they're dropping precipitously. So it can cause a recession in America, and Americans will no longer be able to fund the war. Again, our missiles cost a lot of money, right? We can't keep up at that pace. Meanwhile, Iran is using effective but cheaply engineered weapons, right? It's drones and its missiles, and it has a lot of manpower to draw on, right? Because that's its region, that's its terrain. If America were to put boots on ground, it would be costly. It would be like a suicide mission. That's what a lot of military analysts, intelligence analysts have said, that no, that would be a bad idea, because that terrain is, it's mountainous, it's very difficult, and then Iranians are able to then use unconventional weapons, right? Chemical or biological weapons against American soldiers. They're able to mine the sort of quagmire we experienced in Vietnam. They're able to mine their lands, and so Americans will just be walking into a death trap, right? If they were to put boots on ground. It's different from Iraq, right? Iraq had been severely defeated. Iraq didn't have the sophistication of the Iranian military, by the way. Iran sort of has a modern military. Again, they were top 5 as of the time of the takeover of the Islamic Revolution, when they toppled the Shah's republic. Under the Shah, he had modernized Iran's military, and the US was helping them. Then they were developing a nuclear program. The US was helping them. They have the 5th most powerful military in the world. The sanctions have only made them more innovative and more resilient and hardened them, right? Remember, between 1980 and 1988, they fought a war against Iraq. It was a stalemate, but really they defeated them because Iraq was supported by 2 great powers. The 2 superpowers were supporting Iraq, right? Because they were trying to diminish the power of Iran, right? They were supporting Iraq. That's USSR was supporting Iraq, and the United States was supporting Iraq. They're giving them, military intelligence and all that stuff. And Iraq used chemical weapons against Iran in that war, and Iran has accused the United States of providing the technology and materials to make the chemical weapons that Iraq used against Iran in that war. So this has been a brief analysis of the casualties and the numbers. Again, Iran's asymmetric warfare has been to hit America in terms of the economy, right? In terms of finances, it's obstructing, it's blockaded the Strait of Hormuz, which is responsible for over 20% of the world's oil, and it's affecting Asia. A majority of that oil goes to Asia, China, and the other countries, right? And Asia is responsible for over 50% of the world's manufacturing, uh, world's manufacturing, total manufacturing value added, right? So that's after intermediate products have been, have been removed. That's raw materials, right? China produces most of the world's finished goods. 30% of it, not most, but 30, the largest portion, 30%. But Asia produces the most, over 50%, and a major input, their source of oil is the Strait of Hormuz. Over 80% of their oil comes from that area. And so we're going to see they have reserves. China has over $1.2 billion barrels of oil in reserve. But we're going to see these other powers, these other forces. It's supposed to be a multipolar war now. They're going to get involved because the economics, the war has spread all over the world, and it's going to impact the entire world. They're going to get involved. Already, the United States has accused Iran of supplying intelligence information to Iran, right? The US accused Russia, that Russia was supplying intelligence information to Iran. It looks like China is going to be supporting Iran as well because they're allies, right? China is Iran's biggest trading partner. China buys 90% of Iran's oil. Of course, America has degraded a lot of Iran's refineries, which is now causing like a toxic chemical atmosphere, pollutants, because by the explosion of their refineries and wells is causing toxic pollutants to be released, and suffusing the air in Iran right now. So it's comparatively, Iran, what looks like they want to continue. The indication, the comments from President Trump looks like he's already declaring victory, and so as an off ramp, and so hey, we're still seeing how it goes. My name is Osha. I'm going to stop this video here, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you.